Dwarkesh, thank you so much for being here and talking at this event. I think the first question will just continue the conversation we were having off stage. I don't understand why you spend so much time on prep for your guests on the podcast. I think you've written a lot about like spending weeks in some cases for like individual guests. And I think on your blog, you wrote that it's certainly not because the reason you don't create more episodes is certainly not because you'd run out of interesting people to talk to, but from talking to you about the process of making the podcast, it feels like the central constraint on the show is much more you finding guests that you are truly interested in. Yeah. And that's more like the compass, the kind of like North Star of the show. It's not that you are constrained in the amount of time you have to prep.
Yeah. First of all, Chris, thank you for doing this. I think it's both of those things. So it is the case that there just aren't 52 Karpathis in the world. And I couldn't interview one a week and then make that the podcast. But yeah, given that there's not that many of them, once you do find one, you kind of want to just like dump all your resources into prepping for it. Just make the conversation as good as possible. But I think there's like often this like long tail of things you can look up, which like basically the podcast is just a conversation. The conversation can go in many different directions. And so like you just get another layer of the tree that you searched if you do more prep. Like if the conversation goes here, I kind of have like a better idea of follow-ups and interesting digressions. If the conversation goes there. And I think that actually does end up being like, again, it's like diminishing returns, but like it's worth it if you have like 20 amazing guests a year and you like really want to make them worth it.
Do you feel like your best episodes though were because of the guests themselves or because you were getting deeper in that tree, like the dialogue tree? Because I could imagine that you're like, I mean, these episodes are 2 hours long, right? In some cases. So you're, like, how deep are you really going in that tree? Is it just that like Karpathy had thought a lot about the questions that you were most interested in?
Yeah. So, okay. And just a totally different example. When I interviewed David Reich, here's a totally different field with a bunch of depth to it. David Reich, by the way, is a geneticist of ancient DNA. And I'd done probably 2 weeks of prep for it. I could have done more, but he would just say something right. Like, he would make a claim about how, oh, we know that human intelligence evolved over the last 60,000 years, et cetera, et cetera. And I could be like, no, but didn't you write that other paper where you said that the branches of the human lineage split off 200,000 years ago? And I just like a random sort of like footnote that I had cash, which I wouldn't have had if it was just like, oh, I'm going to skim his book the day before. I might have had it if I'd been like, I'm going to spend the last week reading his book. Certainly I would have had it if I spent 2 weeks, like I'm going to read his review articles and his book. And that happens like, again, any given thing you read is not likely to come up, but like, would a thing you read over 3 weeks of prep come up in like a digression? I think like happens quite often.
Why do you think that your listeners and the audience like that? So like the audience themselves for the podcast has not spent all that time doing the prep.
Yeah.
Isn't it kind of interesting that like, does that imply that the reason the podcast is good is because you sound like an expert on the thing you're talking about? Like that the audience is learning more from you disagreeing with the person than them just explaining their content?
I think it's the same reason that like homework problems are useful when you're learning a subject, where like you could just watch a professor spell out a proof and you're like, now I know linear algebra, right? Like here's the proof of some like the principles of a matrix multiplication. And then like, no, really when you do a homework problem, you kind of see like, what does your intuition line up in this case? Does it line up in this other case? And the harder the problem, like the more ways it could be like teased apart. I think the same thing happens where I like, yeah, sometimes these questions, somebody in the field will definitely know why my question is like naive or like mistaken or like why it doesn't apply. But the person who is the expert in it has sort of like forgotten that they have this deep intuition that it took a bunch of like concrete examples to gather. And so when I'm just like, wait, what about this counterexample? It's like you have a much firmer picture of what they're talking about.
Is the podcast edutainment?
Yeah, I think so.
like is the goal that you're like trying to have the product is people getting educated on the topics you're learning? Like I feel like you don't, it's not most interview podcasts. It's not obvious. It feels like it's a series of profiles or like, I don't know, like Patrick O'Shaughnessy's podcast kind of feels this way. I think, well, maybe you could say they're edutainment also. But do you self-consciously think of what you're making as like a learning product?
Oh, sorry. As opposed to
I guess
personality driven,
as opposed to like biographies or entertainment or like
news.
Yeah. Journalists, right? Like that would be another possibility.
Yeah, I do get frustrated that like so much content about science or history or whatever is about the personalities of the people who made discoveries rather than discoveries themselves. Where I don't know, if you just pick up any popular science book, most of the times it's just like a lot of it's just like anecdotes about like the guy who just made this experiment. You know, his relationship with his wife was rocky when he went to the lab this one day, and I'm like, who gives a
Yeah.
And so I do get frustrated by that, and I try to avoid it in the podcast.
Yeah. How much time do you spend finding your guests? Because it feels like or I don't know, when I was prepping for this and thinking about it, you've talked a lot about how much you admire Robert Caro. And I feel like you have this throwaway comment in a lot of your writing where you're like, hey, like if anyone knows Robert Caro, like get in touch. Or like you always mention this, but I'm like, maybe you and Max should just spend a month like trying to find Robert Caro. Like, have you knocked on his door yet? And then like, how to what lengths would you go to like find the next Carpathy like guest?
I do think in general, we were just reflecting on this past week that I don't invest enough in finding guests. I sort of expect it as of now as a sort of like thing which will spontaneously happen. And it might be something that spontaneously happens in a field I'm sort of in the scene of, like AI. I'm like sort of encountering people. I have a sense of who's interesting, etc.
You could have some AI guests on in the future. Is that
But like, yeah, for example, Sholto or Trenton or Leopold, they were just like friends. I'd met them at parties, and I have a sense of like, they're AI researchers who have a bunch of context, and this will be a good conversation. I obviously don't have that in other fields. Like, who is an interesting neuroscientist to interview? Who's an interesting anthropologist to interview? I might know them if they've written a very popular book or something, but I wouldn't just by default know who's got all these takes. With Caro, actually, I will say that we have given it the good old college try. We have done everything short of knocking on his physical door. We've like tried to reach out to his agent in every which way, like through all his profiles. We've, what else? I mean, we've reached out to the New York Historical Society where he has a strong association to try to get in touch that way. We tried a couple other things. I think the next thing is literally knock on his door. Yeah.
What predicts whether someone will be a good guest on the podcast? Like, I think that so the model that I feel like you're describing is one where you kind of can't tell who people think is interesting to talk to unless you go and spend a bunch of time in one field, which implies that it's not the most famous people in a field. It's like I don't know what is the quality that makes someone a good guest? Like, what is the characteristic you're trying to find out someone has if you spend a bunch of informal time in a field?
I think it's something like their ability to entertain hypotheticals and their ability to draw upon analogies from other fields. I feel like a constant frustration I have with historians is that they're not that, they're just like, not that willing to entertain, okay, what if things had gone this other way? Like, what if this one power in a conflict had X many resources? Does that explain why they won or lost a war? And the other is, often they have like a really good understanding of like other fields and can talk to it. Like, how did the progress of technology in this era affect the outcome of this historical process, or like something in economics you could draw upon? And often they don't, and I feel like it's frustrating even if they're an expert in a given thing, if they can't like really sort of like speak to how it applies to other concepts. I mean, I've had like other guests where I just feel like it's the total opposite. A recent one that feels that way is like Jacob Kimmel, who's a researcher in longevity. And he's like all these ML analogies, like age is a sort of like evolution's length regularizer, and like how that analogy maps on, and stuff like that is like what makes it funniest.
Do you think in that case, is it that you have a frame of something like machine learning that you're applying to all these other fields? Or is it that you want your guests to be able to talk about their area of expertise in the way that you yourself think about it, which is like by analogy to things that are happening in AI? Or does that not resonate? You're just like hypotheticals in general, they need to be able to like make good like cross-domain analogies.
I think it's just like, a lot of times I encounter people who like could interview on the podcast or who ask to come on the podcast, where I really respect their work. If they're a scientist, I think they're like doing important research. If they're, a CEO, I think it's great that their company exists. But fundamentally what they're doing is just like what you would discuss is like how you're filling the pipettes, right? Like there's no sort of conceptual leap. And then like, then it's not that interesting of a conversation. I mean, if you think what they're doing is important, and I like that ability to like step back and be like, okay, like why does this field work this way? And how is it similar to other fields? And et cetera. Is like, well, it makes for the fun conversation.
Do you think that means that they are not that introspective, or like, are many of the best people in many fields just not that introspective or reflective about like the big picture story of what's going on in their field or something? It reminds me a little bit of like macro history in economics, where it's like there's a lot of great economists who aren't macro historians.
Yeah.
Does it feel like that or not?
Yeah. And I think that's just like the nature of science, is just that, like a lot of great science is just very sort of like go down that tree, and it's more about like you need this like new technique to do imaging of different kinds of neurons, and then like how do you get the right dye and the right kind of microscope, and then debugging that whole system or something. It's like not really about like taking a huge step back and like, oh, why did the genome evolve in this way, right? Like I guess that can be relevant, but it seems like practically what a lot of science involves is just, you know, tree search in this way, or there's a sort of like logical leap of like debugging that leads to their discoveries.
Interesting. Okay, so I'm interested in talking about why you think the podcast has been a success.
Yeah.
And I wrote down a list of hypotheses that I came up with. Some of them are kind of obvious. So one is like the preparation and quality of the substance of the episodes themselves. A second one would be like the guest and topic curation, which we've talked a lot about. Another less obvious one maybe would be that you were like filling a niche. That word makes it sound past tense, like you died or something. You will and continue to fill a niche that like was untapped or something, of like AI, extending the like perspective of San Francisco and the AI scene here to like other fields or the rest of the world. And then two other ones would be like your energy level. I think in doing the Warren episode, I saw how you like at the beginning of asking any question, you like really, you do this kind of like guerrilla motion-y thing where you like get pumped up and you're like, let's get pumped up. And it could just be that like other podcasters don't do that. And I think that comes through in the episodes.
Yeah.
Like you look like, I don't know, you look physically animated. And then the last one could just be your appearance. It could be that like, it could be that people like the way you look, and that's like an advantage relative to other podcasters. So, I'm not,
as much as I would like to think that's what it is, I don't think that's what it is.
Okay.
But on the sort of getting animated before episodes, there was a time where I was just taking this to the extreme, like 6 to 8 months ago, and I interviewed this physicist, Adam Brown. And before I just thought like YouTube really cared about the energy level going into an episode. Like if you want retention, you just gotta like hook people with your energy.
Look at the hand on the table right now. Okay, go ahead.
And so I re-recorded the intro to that like multiple times to get the highest energy level version. I'm like, today I'm interviewing Adam Brown.
Yeah.
And all the comments are like, man, Dwarkesh is spending the podcast money on blow. No, I think like
there were like, you retaped the opening to the Gordon thing many times being like, today.
Yeah, exactly. I think
this is Mr. Beast era.
I think honestly, it's just that, like, if you could host a good podcast, you usually have better things to do. Like, in some sense, it's a really competitive field. There's millions of podcasts. But in another, just like the opportunity cost of somebody who could do a podcast about science or tech is just like so high that like, why would you, right? Like, why would you host an AI podcast instead of being like actually working in AI or something? And I feel like I have contingent reasons or that for why that happened to me. Just like I started doing it at a time when my opportunity cost of my time was really low. And then like I kept doing it while like it kept the keeping doing the podcast continued to stay like more interesting than the opportunity cost. But I fundamentally think like if you already know a bunch about AI, why would you start a podcast?
Well, okay, so I feel like there are many people working in AI who having a platform and like a space, like you talk a lot about how amazing your job is and how open-ended it is. I feel like once you're at the scale that you are at now, it's like kind of a more desirable job than being like a junior like researcher at an OpenAI, Anthropic or whatever. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, actually, so then I think it comes down to just that there's like a reliable path, even if it's harder. Like I think, obviously I work hard on the podcast and stuff, but like day to day, I'm like trying to figure out what the next most interesting thing is, read about it, do the interview, chat with the person who I'm most excited to chat about with, then like restart the process. So it's an enjoyable thing, but like there isn't a predictable, like I really couldn't have predicted a couple years ago this is where the podcast would end up. In a way that like if you work reasonably hard at like teaching yourself ML, you know that you like either if you're good enough, you're gonna be an AI researcher or something. Like there's not really an equivalent here. Like there's not really a predictable set of steps.
Well, you saw the growth, right?
Yeah.
I remember 2 years ago you pointing and being like, if I keep up this growth, it'll grow to be this big.
Right.
And I don't know what those numbers were. I don't remember what they were, but I'm guessing that it's just exactly what happened.
Yeah, I guess once you're on that, I don't know, just like what do you think it is? Because I think like it probably comes down to the fact that it was just like an odd thing to plan on. Like, oh, if my podcast was 10x a year, and eventually there will be millions of listeners, and then it'll be a viable career, right? Like it's a sort of like weird thing to plan out of college.
It could, it could be that it could be that the start isn't desirable. Like the reason it could be that your situation is unusual because it's much better to be a junior, like AI researcher than it is to be like Dwarkesh for the first 3 years of the podcast. And so then it's like, you don't kind of like notice the gradient of you basically have to do the like boring years for a long time until you get to the good years. And you were just like very young when you had the bad years and now you're in the good years.
Yeah.
It could be like people might worry that you've tapped the market for the, like, I mean, it's a strange.
I do not think that's the case, by the way. Like in some sense, I just like recognize, I have a bunch of really smart friends that I kind of recognize that like, if they decided to do a full-time podcast, in their relevant domains, I think they would just like fucking kill it. I should have checked with Mercury. I got a lot of things. Yeah. And so I mean, even now, like people launch podcasts and I'm just like, this is really great. Like it's an investing podcast or something. I just fundamentally think, you could just, there's like a lot of like sub niches that you can still fill in. So I think it's more of the, it's not like an obvious thing you should do. Sure.
I think that those people could end up coming up with a expert podcast, not a, so the thing that's like enjoyable about the Dwarkesh podcast, I think is partially like Dwarkesh's brand as this like energetic, like youngster who's excited to learn the thing with like a big smile and ask you lots of like earnest questions. Mm-hmm. And I feel like those people, or one story is that those people would come out with a like expert interviewing other experts, or would come off that way. And so it would be like interesting, but to a much narrower set of people. Whereas you get like people who don't know anything about really esoteric technical domains to listen to you debating an expert substantively in that field because they trust that like Dwarkesh isn't that far ahead of where they could be if they spent some time learning about the topic.
Yeah.
Does this...
That kind of maps on it.
Okay. Yeah. What would you... Well, so one question I had prepped, but maybe we've already covered it now, is like, if you were trying to give really like tough love advice to someone who you really cared about and whose like time you really valued, who told you that they were going to start a podcast, what is the reason that they would fail? Or like, okay, maybe it's not.
You're considering a career change, Chris?
It's my first episode. I think so. Like, okay, so two questions. One is like, what would you tell that person? I don't want to like give you puppy eyes. And then, like, why do people fail? Like, what, you know, maybe you see some like abortive attempts where people try to make a podcast that you think is like kind of similar, but it doesn't work. I'll take notes for the first one.
I have a bunch of thoughts. Like, if you are going to start the podcast, here's my advice. Here's the most common failure modes. One, if you do have a lot of context in a field, just having the conversation you would have with your guests that you would have if you were getting drinks or getting dinner is the way to go. And people just have this failure mode where they tend to fall back on this mode of, here, I need to ask this, so it will instigate some exposition, which will then lead to the audience having context, and then we can move on. I think that's just terrible. I think you just like have the people are just super interesting when you're just like hanging out and you're just like poking holes and whatever. And for some reason, people will just get in a different mode when they're doing a podcast.
You mean they ask a bunch of questions they know the answers to, in effect, because do like an intro,
or they're like, and how did you get into this field? And like, why did you write this book?
Biographical question.
Exactly. Yeah. And I feel like at a dinner party, it's like kind of normal to just be like, oh, I read your article. Like, wait, that was stupid. Like, why'd you say that or something? Right. And then, I'm now noticing a contradiction in what I was saying earlier, where I'm like, oh, this niche is totally open. I know you can do it. Where like, if people have come up to me and asked if they should start a podcast, and I'm like, eh. And I think it's just like, I've watched one or two that they produced, and they're just like, it's just not that interesting. I don't know how to capture what makes it less compelling. I think they're like not involving themselves enough, where they're like, there's like nothing new in the way they're asking questions. They're just helping an already famous guest regurgitate their talking points.
Is it they're interviewing too famous of people, like people who are on like a book tour?
Yeah, that's a big part of it. Let me try to think about other reasons. I think it's not. Yeah, the energy isn't like super playful. It just feels kind of dull often. Yeah. But do you have some sense? Like, what would you say to somebody who's like, I want to start a podcast? Here's the biggest one. I think like people just don't understand that they have to convince other people to listen to this thing. They don't treat marketing their product as a first class.
So they don't do clips or whatever. They don't do that.
Like clips is a very small part of it. I mean, it's a very important part of it. But like, just fundamentally, when you put it out there, have you put a bunch of thought into like, what is the title? What is the tweet? This is the way that people will like, especially if you don't have a built-in audience. This is the only information a stranger has about like whether there's something compelling going on here. And like, have you done theory of mind and like what somebody thinks of when they see this? Like, what kind of content are they expecting? And then I think if you do a really good job of these things, you would immediately make a super viral podcast.
Yeah.
I think compound growth is basically fake. Like I have seen many things that like somebody puts out a first product and it gets millions of views or hundreds of thousands of views. If it's good enough, I think essays is a clear example where to see this, where like situational awareness or AI 2027, disagree or agree with it. Somebody had clearly put in months of work into like making this Schelling point, like this manifesto. And, like immediately it's like the most significant thing in terms of AI discourse that's happened that year, respectively. And it was like in both cases by people who had no audience whatsoever beforehand.
Well, but they had people who were prepared to promote it who had large platforms.
That's right. Yeah.
Right. So they were both like people who were widely respected among a small set of people who are themselves influential.
Right. But don't you think in the world where they weren't like, they didn't come on my podcast the day it was announced or something, would still do really well? I think that just downstream of the fact that people are like eager. If you can just give them this thing of like, here's the condensed like worldview that I'm putting out there, and you can just ingest it. I think it just like would do incredibly well. You like overnight become a sort of celebrity in terms of the people who are interested in this discourse, and you'd get like 1 billion inbound emails from famous people who are like, let's get coffee or dinner. And I think the reason that doesn't happen is that there's like not that many people who have like super like have spent like years coming up with this worldview that's really great.
It's hard to control for quality, but I feel like I have seen a range of different people try to do the like beige AI worldview site, and I have a sense that it is like quite like connected to. It's hard to say. It's hard to quality control.